What American company's radio went on to strongly influence a small Japanese company in post-World War II Japan that would eventually become a very household name, especially during the 60s and 70s, the height of Japanese entrance into the American market? This little guy, this is the Hallicrafters S-38 series of radios. We're going to talk about this radio and how it influenced Trio, a small Japanese company, and turned that company into the company Kenwood. I'm Kerry Gray, and this is Stranger's Things. The Hallicrafters company produced this radio, the S-38 series, starting right after World War II in 1946, just as the boys were coming back home. And the Hallicrafters company produced this radio, which carries forward from the war era a very utilitarian, almost military look. Hallicrafters built radios very similar that were used by vets in the Eastern Theater during World War II. And so I think that was the other reason. They leveraged some of those designs, simplified it, and came up with the S-38 series. This series was so popular, it lasted nearly 15 years, from 1956 with the original S-38 through 1961, the S-38D and E series. So there were a total of 5 iterations of this series, and they really just featured minor cosmetic changes, paint color, things like that, dial color. Most of the electronics were more simplified and the circuits on the inside. Cabinet design was actually a separate sort of work function of the circuit design. Some of these designs are really fabulous, actually, and that's what drives collectors to go after them. The whole concept of the 38 series was inexpensive. Tubes by this time were, well, cheap, pretty inexpensive, actually. And the supporting circuitry around the tubes was also pretty sparse. I think in the 38C, there are only 7 capacitors, typically are 10 to 14, and they can get pretty wedged down in there. But with only 7, you can keep these radios going forever because they're pretty easy to change out once they get old. So there's only 7 caps and probably not much more, maybe a dozen resistors. The rest is coils, knobs, switches, lights, wires. So they really put a lot of thought into the design to keep it cheap, keep it simple, and also keep it reliable, which is why 60-some years later, these guys still work with minimal amount of restoration going into them. It's through that design that these radios probably still survive today. Plus, they're made of metal. The metal over time, over decades, is certainly much more robust. And the worst case scenario, you repaint it. Now, and this is what we call a light restoration. When we got this in, we did throw a very light coat of matching paint on the body of the cabinet because the paint is peeling. The fascia plate of the cabinet, we tend not to touch those, mostly because we haven't come up with a process yet that allows us to either maintain or restore the lettering. And so what we usually do is touch up with a closely matching appliance paint, even if it doesn't match exactly like in this case, actually adds to its sort of, I've been beat up a little bit, I've lived some decades sort of appearance on the front. The knobs on these radios were Bakelite. They had tons of it going into the war, and they were left with tons of it coming out. So what do you do with it? Well, you make knobs. And that's what they did. This plastic dial it's made with a newer plastic, obviously, because after World War II, there were obviously many more variations of plastic. This plastic is very robust. They're still clear, not cloudy, haven't yellowed, which was a problem with the earlier plastics leading into the war. This has actually a colored dial. It's sort of a green dial, whereas the C, or at least the C that I have, they dispensed with the color, probably to keep the cost down. So on this cabinet, the only knob that didn't come with it that isn't original is the selector knob, which I believe comes from a later model or maybe something entirely different. It is actually plastic, where the other three are Bakelite. This one was also gray, so we oil painted it black to better match. It's almost not an identical match for the design of the other knobs, but it's close enough. On these radios, like I said, they were very easy to service, very easy to work on, and missing original parts is not uncommon. They were meant to be serviced. They were meant to keep going. They weren't meant to just work and then, put in the attic or throw away. So the cool thing about the 38 series, despite their inexpensive cost, they had some pretty cool features. Variable BFO, that really is targeted more specifically toward ham radio operators, not commercial radios. So speaking of ham or amateur band, this, like most radios of the time, carried not only the standard broadcast medium wave or AM, commercial AM, but this one also has 3 ham or amateur bands as well in the medium wave. One of the great ways of economy is they didn't waste money on lettering. They just used 1, 2, 3, 4, and then use these little white lines to show you, to point to the dial, which was already made here, which band number 1 would point to. Well, that's the standard broadcast band, referred to as BC. You turn that to number 2, and that would point you to that scale. The dial itself is all done in the same scale, which I thought was interesting. So they just did the scale in the fraction of megacycles. So if you were trying to tune in 770, for instance, you're going to see on the dial not 770 or even 77, you're going to see 0.7 for 700, because 0.7 is 700 kilocycles. It's 0.7 of 1 megacycle. Although it might look foreign to people who are used to seeing, 550, 560, 770, yada, yada. It's really no different, because once you get over 1,000, it starts to not make sense again. And that's because the standard broadcast band extends from kilocycles up to 1 megacycle, and then up to today, up to 1.7 megacycles. So I thought that was pretty interesting. That way the scale really reads kind of the same, but it is a little disrupted if you're used to seeing 550, 640, 770 up the scale. The band spread, which is really just a fancy way of saying BFO, the instructions say just leave it in the upright position for commercial broadcast or even for shortwave, although it does have an effect on those bands and you can get some pretty interesting results. It really isn't intended for that. It's intended for code. The other cool, neat thing about this platform is, of course, it's tube operated, and tubes take time to warm up. So what Hallicrafters did is they put in this switch here called standby and receive. This is actually one of the earliest implementations of what is pretty common in all home electronics today. Even our smart TVs have a standby feature, which really became popular in the 70s and even more so in the 80s with the Japanese products. Remember, I talked about Kenwood in the beginning. So all standby does is cut off the cathode in the second tube, which is interesting, but that definitely has the effect of muting it, essentially. It doesn't really turn the radio off. In this case, this just turns off the RF, IF, and audio from progressing past the second tube in the chain. and therefore muting it. And the idea was, well, if you're listening to radio and you're taking a telephone call or having a conversation with somebody and you just want to temporarily quiet the radio without messing with the adjustments, or worse, turning it off and then having to wait 20 to 30 seconds for it to warm up again, you just flip that switch into standby and it's ready for you when you come back, and it's going to come right back on. Simple on-off volume. The two switches over here, we'll start with speaker phones. So these all came with the ability to connect headphones in the back, not through a standard 1/4-inch TRS that we are familiar with today, even the minis, but through some, sort of war era banana plug style that you would need headphones that were designed of the era to plug in. But when you did, it would shut the speaker off so you could listen in private. The other switch here is AM and continuous wave. So this is a really cool feature, but most home radios, I don't think any home radios actually, had the ability to turn it into a receiver for Morse code specifically. So continuous wave is where the band spread, or BFO, comes in, and this is variable. And then your big knob over here is obviously tuning through the bands. So this one came to us from a prop shop here in New Mexico. That's a prop house that had gone out of business. This one did work, as did the C model, but this one was in a little bit, they were both in rough condition. So the prop shop did some work on the C model, rebuilding the back panel and rebuilding the bottom panel, which they really did a terrific job with. This one had both its panels. It did not come with the plug, which had an interlock on it, so you didn't electrocute yourself. So we found a two-prong plug that is much more modern, and we oil painted the cord in period correct brown, just so that it wouldn't stand out that this is a newer cord that's black. We cut off a lot of the leading plastic so that it has a nice, snug, tight fit, as it should. It works perfect. It's oil painted brown, and it's just enough to not detract from a distance that it may or may not be the original cord. The cords were brown that came with these, but finding the original cord for this is probably going to be challenging. These are standard long wire antennas, so they do require at least a 13 to 15 foot long wire running along the floor wherever it's convenient, with the grounds shunted over, which they are in this case. Now you can drop that connection and use your own dipole setup or long wire setup that you might have, and provide your own ground, usually from a water pipe or a ground rod. But in the simplest configuration, which you would find primarily in the majority of homes, then you would leave those two joined together and then just use a single long wire to dramatically improve reception. In the 50s, AM radio was everywhere, was prevalent. You had not only your clear channel full power, but interspersed across America's vast landscape were smaller power, different class stations that would fill in the gaps. So the point being, back in the 50s, the dial was full of stations, local and far. Today, not so much. As we turn this on, we're going to find the lower end of the band, the lower frequencies below 1 megahertz, pretty much vacant. And that's with a 15, 18 foot long wire attached. We'll find more on the upper part of the band, but only about 6 to 8 stations. The programming on AM today in this metropolitan market is very niche. The rest of the band is dead, and that is too bad. The radio itself, as we get ready to fire it up here, is an All-American 5. The chassis itself is isolated from the outer metal body. So it is important if you're servicing these to make sure those isolation points are integral, because the chassis is hot regardless of how it's plugged in. So keep that in mind. Other than that, it's a standard AA5, 4 tubes to the circuit. There's the beauty of the AA5. They can make these tubes do more than one thing at the same time, thereby cutting the number of tubes down, and then you just have your 5th tube, which is the rectifier. So let's turn on this Model S-38B. Has a single typical indicator light that will take the initial surge, so it'll light up bright initially until all the tubes come to temperature. On this one, the light is actually bright enough to see. You can actually see it here. It's daytime. I just turned the overhead off. But this one has a pretty nice light on it. You can see it even in the broad daylight, so it's lighting up the dial nicely. And so that I've demonstrated that, I'm going to turn the overhead back on so I can see what I'm doing. So we're down here at 550, I believe, is the bottom of the band on broadcast. And as I skim through here the dial, I'm only going to hit one station on this lower end of the band that I happen to know is there, which is a sports talk station. And it is 610, the sports animal. It is actually not a strong station. So as we go up the band, and I get a little bit, oh my goodness. We found another station. That looks about 680. WCBM? WCBM. I know that one. WCBM. I called it right. But I thought WCBM was, it goes back a way. I thought it was like San Antonio, or I'm not sure where WCBN is, but so I gotta say, I am just as surprised as you, but I know the reason I'm getting that. And that's the story, part of the story I was trying to get to before I intercepted this station. So I'll look that one up and add it as a post. All right, I'm gonna drop this in. This is an update on the video shot the day before on this Hallicrafters S-38B. As we were demonstrating it and tuning up the dial, we picked up this station at what appeared to be 6:80 a.m. It's not one I've ever heard before. As you watch through later in that video, you'll discover why, as we talk about the big 50,000 watt flamethrower that usually wipes it out. The bigger story is it appeared we were listening to a station called WCBM. WCBM, I've had time to research it, is Baltimore. Although not impossible, it is kind of improbable today. Yeah, I remember in the 60s listening to KFI Los Angeles and Richmond, Virginia in the late afternoon, but that was in the 60s. It's not the way it is today, so it was really unlikely, but I showed the beginning of that snippet and you can clearly hear them saying WCBM. WCBM, I know that one, WCBM. So I just spent the last hour listening to this station to figure out just WTF, because that really isn't possible during the day to hear WCBM Baltimore in New Mexico. So what is going on? Well, I have a whole page of notes here, some that I've taken from listening to this station and then quickly researching as I got more information. This station that we're listening to clarify, the signal is actually an Albuquerque station located at 700 kilocycles. I just got very clear confirmation that the programming is originating from WCBM Baltimore Maryland. The content you're hearing behind me is actually the Rob Carson show, which I looked up and did the research on, does appear on WCBM Baltimore. And WCBM Baltimore is owned by the Maryland company. This is just not really, it's not plausible. Not in this good a condition where I could listen to this. So what's going on? Where else closer would there be a 680? And the closest would be Clovis, New Mexico. I'd mentioned San Antonio. There is a 680 there that's, 680 is a clear channel. WCBM itself is a clear channel, but it's a Class B and it's directional all the time. So there's a lot of stations on 680. Although Clovis, New Mexico would be more realistic for me to hear in Albuquerque, it really doesn't have that kind of power. In trying to figure this out, I've concluded by researching a different angle, what is on the air in Albuquerque near 680. And there is one that comes up, KDAZ, KDAZ. KDAZ is at 700. So during the hour, I was listening for a legal ID. And once, and only once in an hour, did I hear KDAZ. There's a lot of really mixed identification going on this particular signal. The only thing I do know for certain is this is the Rob Carson show, which is a syndicated show. It does air on WBCM in Baltimore. We hear programming from Baltimore, ID'd as WBCM. The closest station this could possibly be to that frequency is KDAZ, Albuquerque, which is also carries, according to their website, the Rob Carson show. And we're about to go into some breaks here. Some of these commercials you may even hear in the background are referencing Maryland cities and towns and things like that. KDAZ is a very tiny AM station, 450 watts daytime. Tower is about 25 miles from here south, and 450 watts daytime, theoretic or ideally, might get you 20 miles usable. And in my experience with 500 watt stations, you might get 20 miles. So I looked up the primary map for KDAZ, and it shows its primary daytime signal reaching probably about another 10 miles north of here and even across the mountain. And I can already tell you that that's an ideal situation. In reality, it's not going to get that far in good condition. So where I'm at matches the experience, in my experience, of a 450 watt station with a tower located easily 20, maybe 25 miles from here. If that's true, then what I'm actually listening to is 700 kilocycles, not 680. But I'm hearing content from 680 Baltimore WCBM. Now, KDAZ is owned by Pan American Broadcasting. They claim on their website to also carry Rob Carson. I am currently listening to the Rob Carson syndicated show. I've heard more identifications for WCBM Baltimore in an hour than I have heard for KDAZ, the local station. It is improbable to be certain, if not downright impossible, for me to hear Baltimore. So one entity is rebroadcasting the content of another entity on the other side of the country. I am absolutely certain that's what I am hearing. Without an agreement of these two stations between them, similar to what's called an LMA, a local marketing agreement, which clearly Baltimore and Albuquerque are not in the same local market, but a similar copyright agreement, what I'm hearing would not be nominal. How's that for a safe word? Long story short, if what I'm hearing, and I'm confident that's what I'm hearing a local 450 watt AM station at 700 KC rebroadcast WCBM's stream from Baltimore. That's why I kind of have to leave that. Copyright law would require that these two stations have at least an agreement amongst themselves for such a situation to be nominal. And even then, the local station broadcasting the signal over the air needs to maintain its own legal requirement of station identification. That's a clarification on the earlier segment from the video yesterday where we were like stunned. We were even getting a station at 600 or 680 or 700, much less WCBM out of Baltimore. So hopefully I'll be able to cut this together with the prior footage and sort of make sense of it, because where it came from is we were scanning up the dial to hear how many stations we could get on this, and we intercepted the signal, and you heard it, WCBM clearly being identified, but it's clear as day that this is WCBM Baltimore being ID'd as such in Albuquerque, New Mexico, over another radio station owned by a separate entity, and it's the keyword owned or ownership that's key to copyright law. This is the very reason why legal identification is required for over-the-air stations, because I probably spent 2 hours already on this trying to identify the origin of this signal. You can use your own imagination, but I needed to clarify that for the video, because I'm doing a video on this receiver and how many stations it could pick up. We came across that, and that was that needed further explanation and further exploration. So, gonna go back, continue up the dial. So I'm roughly 700 now, 720, but I'm getting awful close to 770. What's going to be funny here, or fun and funny, nobody was hurt. It's probably not going to be there. Barely distinguish a voice at 770. Now let me reset. So 770 is a clear channel, 50,000 watt. Its tower is probably no more than 3 miles as the crow flies from my house. Where's KOB, or KKOB as it's known today, since 1985, I think? Well, it should be right there. Let me go up a little bit. That's a 800 or 810, so that's a different station that we won't get normally. It's a country station coming in nice. The weather's really good today or something. That's actually coming in quite nice. But that's an Albuquerque or a New Mexico station. Or I shouldn't say Albuquerque, but it's a New Mexico station. And so, where's our border blaster? You know, our flamethrower, our 50,000 watt clear channel flamethrower. Well, if you know anything about New Mexico or Albuquerque, this is balloon capital of the states, meaning hot air balloon. And about 20 years ago, a balloon hit their primary tower. That would be the daytime tower, the only tower during the day, unrestricted, and the middle tower in their figure 8 pattern at night. They had to turn off their transmitter for about 2.5 hours. No big deal, nobody was hurt, nobody died, a balloon died. Turned it back on and everything is hunky-dory. Tower 2 miles that direction, balloon 2 miles that direction. And they all take off, they come over my house. But this last year in 2025, so that would be about a month and a half prior to this video being made, another balloon hits the very same tower. That was 6 weeks ago. When it hit the tower this time, The tower did not survive. It folded like a cheap suit from Men's Warehouse. This time the balloon did not hit the tower per se, it hit a guy wire. By the time that wire snapped, the wind and the breeze acting on that tower, it started going over, and like I said, it folded like a cheap suit. It was catastrophic. So obviously they went off the air because that was during the day, and that was that tower they used during the day. So nobody hurt, everything is fine. The only fatality was 770 KKOB's primary tower. They're not using that site anymore. They're using an alternate site. I just looked this up at the FCC database because I'm like, where is it? I should be getting it. I'm getting nothing. And I found that through a filing by their engineering, they're now broadcasting from essentially a long wire. Literally, it's a wire that is on a pre-existing tower to the west of Albuquerque on a hill that's called 9 Mile Hill, because it's 9 miles away from town and it's a hill, so it looks down on Albuquerque. But there's a lot of towers out there, and there's an existing tower that hosts a lot of backup facilities for a lot of stations, and they basically just dropped a wire down to a 1,000-watt transmitter because the tower is in use. You know, it has 8 to 10 radials, as the report says. It's just a brief engineering report, so it doesn't go into much detail. They strung up a wire with some radials up the center of an existing tower, no other AMs around, all FM or microwave, and are feeding it with a 1,000-watt transmitter. I never truly appreciated how weak a 1,000-watt AM broadcast is through just a simple long wire. It is weak, because I am 11 miles from that tower site, and this is what I get. KKOB right now is pretty much broadcasting to what we call the West Mesa and downtown Albuquerque, and they're doing that 24/7 because they have no other control, but they have to be on the air. They have to be on the air with something. They've been off the air with their 50,000-watt flamethrower status for, I think this is the 3rd week, going into the 4th week. So I don't know, it's going to be interesting to see, but typically you'd be blasted and it would bleed over the other adjacent channels. But the cool thing is it does allow me to finally hear stations that I know have been buried under there, such as this one, that I would never be able to hear before. Now this one's at 810 or 820. It was still being overshadowed by the signal of KKOB, but it's the country station. Hey, I've never heard it before. So let's continue. This is a religious station now in the 900s, so we're approaching that 1 megacycle. I think this is 980-ish. And this comes in very nice. So I go up the station, we get into an even stronger one at about 1,000 or 1 megacycle. They go up the band, I get carriers and a little bit of intelligence. That one's the sort of a rock station. It's out of an adjacent community, and it's the only one that just plays music programming like the old days. That's another religious station. This is a native station. Another one. What are we up to? 6, 7? That's a Spanish station. 8. This is another religious. And then I believe this is sports. There's another sports. So we're at 8 or 9 on this guy. And you can hear, very nice. It's very impressive. Very impressive. But you can see almost the entire bottom half of the band below 1,000 is vacant.